We have distressed property markets. We have speculation in the properties. Does that remind you of anything? Very close to home. We have illiquidity of savings. In other words, all these people that put their money into this little property, but the property doesn't have marketability, it's not tradable. So it's pretty much like putting your savings in a black hole, right? And then, very interesting is limited labor mobility. We notice that people do not feel comfortable moving out of that community and finding a job in another community, or travel from one community to another community for a job, or travel from the place I showed you in Lima to the center of the city, because they're actually worried that somebody's going to take over their properties. And they have very little recourse in kicking them out. That was a serious problem I was noticing when I lived in south of Italy. People would move out of their homes to go to work, and then they would come back home in the evening and somebody else would have taken their homes. This is an example that would happen here and there, but it would happen, and it would be extremely difficult to pull these guys out. And another aspect is, of course, the fact that we have very weak capital markets and limited investment in infrastructure, and that investment in infrastructure can be utilities, telecom, and so on. The social impacts, which are rather interesting, and I was really excited because when I did my reform in Peru, I managed to actually measure those. It's easy to talk about them, but it's hard to measure them. So it's really the fact that we have sustainable poverty. The more informal property you have, the more poverty you have. And once you have that, and you don't manage to resolve the property rights issue, what you end up having is basically we give handouts to those people. So we have communities that live out of regular development aid that doesn't really permeate, doesn't really go down to the root of the issue. So we have, of course, violence, corruption, criminality. All of Eastern Europe is full of that, you know it. And most of these areas, even in the United States, that are fully informal, are taken over by criminality and corruption. Middle class is very thin, because as I said, it generates this disparity of those who have and those who have not. And what I was really impressed to notice, and my eyebrows went all the way up there when I saw that child labor is rather higher in those areas than in areas with formal property ownership. And that's really because when you're not feeling secure to leave your home, you will have a lot of cottage industries working from home, and your kids work with you. So that also affects vaccination and health care in the community and so on. Now, what else is also happening is that we have some element of social discontent. That does not last for too long. In other words, people do end up getting up and getting upset with the government or getting upset with whatever. So we end up having these huge amounts, we notice it in many, many occasions, where you have discontent being generated and piling up year after year. And the issue of the environmental distortion is rather clear in the sense that we have land degradation, a lot of misuse of property and misuse of land by either irrigating it too much or by misusing it in terms of it's urban and we use it as rural or vice versa. Another aspect is that we have very bad waste management systems. Most of these places, their garbage is collected in the middle of the community and they burn it right there, in the middle of the urban residential areas. And also there is a much higher carbon footprint. I was talking about it with Benoit earlier. Now, is there a solution? As I said, I applied it in Peru. Yes, there is a solution. And the solution would be to transform, right? Of course, have informal property or liquid property or unreal, whatever you want to call it. And why don't we just transform it? But is it that easy? Actually, it is easy to do the work. What is difficult is to get there, to have it started. And what we need to take into consideration for a successful transformation is three things. One is to have a vision. Where do you really want to get the community to, the country to? What is the actual outcome? We want to transform people's ownership and make it secure forever, not just once. Because a lot of reforms that I see around are just trying to, today, give people titles of ownership as if this is going to help people's life. They already have titles of ownership. They already know who owns what. That's not the issue. The issue is to have a system that will be taking care of your savings today into infinity. And your inheritances and your sales that will take place from now to the future. So your vision is really, really important. Rigor is another very important element. So why do I say that? Because you are not supposed to be starting today the reform and then U-turn after, a few months' time, simply because, there is no discipline, people don't fully get it, they don't understand it, they're afraid of change, they're afraid of the fact that maybe they're going to be, some groups that may not be happy about it, so let's really not do it fully, let's do it halfway. I'm sorry, this is not going to work out. I've seen it way too many times. So rigor is super important. And the last part is actually trust. So trust means that the change that you have made is actually bought by the citizens, is bought by the owners. So you do the change in the government level, right? And it trickles down to the citizens. So the citizens are actually using that system. So that's a litmus test. So if the trust element is not there, we don't really have much of a successful result. So what would be the elements that we should be looking into? Number one, land and property is a unique characteristic of asset in economics. It's not just an economic asset, the first bullet. It's a social asset as well. If you look at it only as a social asset, and you look at it as habitat for humanity, housing for the poor, affordable housing, all these beautiful titles that we have in most of these development agencies that go around the world, it doesn't work. It really does not. Or projects in America. Oh gosh, we had lots of those in the 70s, right? They don't work. They generate ghettos, they generate it's a short-term mechanism just to appease a little bit populations, and that's it. Why is that? Because there is no incentive for the individual to actually take care of that house. There is no incentive, the individual wants to use the house for economic and social purposes. Has a shelter, as a social aspect, but it has an economic aspect to it. Now, if you only look at it as an investment, and only as an economic asset, then again you're out of line. Because it also has home elements to it. It's, your first home or your second or something of that sort. So you can't just speculate on it fully and only and have a regulatory framework in looking at property as a speculative investment or a separate regulatory framework looking at property as a housing. No, it should all be together. The second thing is you need to diagnose, in my book I call second chapter, I present a methodology called reality check analysis. This is actually a rather good methodology to use because it allows for the diagnoser, the analyst, to go all the way down to the bottom of the actual problem. When did the system break at the first time? What were afterwards the patches that happened throughout history and throughout the evolution of the institutional change? Super important to figure that out because today you think in 2010 that a problem, I'm saying you meaning all of us, we think that a problem when we go to a country or a market is X. But if we cannot really isolate it. This problem is an evolutionary outcome of a series of elements that took place in the past. And if we don't take those elements into consideration, we actually will not know what other type of latent interests may show up the moment we're trying to reform, and our whole reform may be totally wrong-footed. We've seen a lot of those as well. So what we do is we go to a country in reality check and we try to see how